Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. Alrighty, everybody. So our last episode ended our social issues series, at least for the time being. We'll see if I end up doing any more episodes related to that topic. I most likely will in the future, but that at least ends the series as it stands for now. So this episode, we are going to talk about utopianism, and this should be fairly clear to what the word means to everybody. But utopianism is basically the idea that we can create utopia in this life without any help from God or anything else. Or maybe, I guess potentially it could be with help from God, but it would be utopia in this life, and we can create it. And, there are varying degrees of utopianism, and it pretty much is a constant temptation, you could say, to humanity throughout history. You can think of people like Alexander the Great trying to build his one world empire, right? And he came pretty close to doing it until it split up into the three separate empires and then slowly disintegrated into nothing over the next 500 or so years after his death. But he did pretty good for himself. More recent examples would be the more hardcore socialists and communists. This would be a pretty good example of utopianism. They're trying to create, through economic means, create a society where all people are equal, where there's no poverty, no crime, all these sorts of things. And, I would argue the fundamental problem with utopianism, or any variant thereof, is that it's impossible. It's impossible to create a society that has any facet of it which would be perfected or perfectible, right? So there's no possible way to perfect an economy. There's no possible way to get rid of poverty. There's no possible way to get rid of suffering. There's no possible way to get rid of even just the things that aren't, maybe they're not bad, but they're just not as good as they could be, right? You have those imperfections in life. And there's no way to get rid of these things on a massive scale, on a societal scale. And that's precisely what utopianism tries to do. And I think it's a very easy type of thing to fall into. We can start to think, even Christians will fall into this. If we could just bring back Christendom, then everything would be perfect. Well, no, clearly not. Christendom wasn't perfect. Now, it's a debatable question whether Christendom was better than what we have today, and I think in many ways it was, but that doesn't mean it was perfect, and it doesn't mean reviving Christendom would bring some sort of perfect society. Same within the liturgical movements within the Catholic Church. They can oftentimes be prey to this sort of utopianism, this utopianism. If we could only have the perfect liturgy, the Catholic Church would be in the right spot, would be where it needs to be, right? And we end up making an idol almost of maybe the past or of the future. This can also happen in religious communities. I've shared this a little bit in the past, that I was involved in some religious orders that were trying to get, or a religious order that was trying to get started up. And there were definitely certain strains of people within that order who had a utopianistic mentality at certain points, myself included at certain points. So I'm not saying that I've ever been immune from this sort of thinking, because even if one isn't trying to create utopia in society generally, either of a country or of the whole world, one can try to do it on a local level. One can try to do it on a community level, like within a religious community or a parish or a diocese. And there's a certain amount of, this can become like a too optimistic type of an outlook on life. And oftentimes it requires a lot of suffering for the person or the group of people to be kind of jarred out of this sort of an outlook on life. I would see, if you look at the Soviet Union as a whole, really the goal of communism there was to create a more perfect society, or even a perfect society. And the only way that people woke up from it was from a great amount of suffering that occurred. Because inevitably, when we don't try to form our goals out of reality, they oftentimes will bring more suffering than good. If I'm trying to make the perfect podcast, let's say, well, I will do everything in my power to make it, likable for people, make it enjoyable for people to listen to, good content, good editing, all this sorts of stuff. And if I try to make everything perfect, I might never end up publishing an episode. There would be a sort of perfectionism that would be involved in that, to where you never end up making the leap and actually finishing anything because you're so focused on making it perfect, right? And then, also I could become so arrogant into thinking that my podcast is so amazing and wonderful, right? And generally, when people have an outright arrogant sort of a mentality, people don't usually want to listen to somebody like that. You're probably not the most humble person in the world. You're not. If you think you are, you're not. But people generally don't want to listen to somebody who's outright prideful. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's just some thoughts on this utopianism and some of the dangers that can come along with it. Again, I think some of the main versions of this that we have seen in recent years have been socialism and communism. And honestly, a lot of capitalism is built upon a certain utopianism as well. At least on maybe a smaller scale, where people try to create, the perfect company or the perfect, family, all these sorts of things. And it just never works. Reality will eventually smack you in the face. Well, more like punch you in the face. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Probably don't have much more to say about this in regards to this, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that it's a mentality we want to stay away from, because ultimately it leads us away from reality. And even in the church, these things can happen. I've seen it firsthand, but then obviously in wider society it happens as well. So we want to just beware of any sort of perfectionism or utopianism that can arise. I do think it may be, actually, I said I was going to close this, but another thought came to me, that it's interesting to kind of reflect on this according to an individual person. Can the individual person create a utopia within themselves? And on one level, of course, the question is no. There will always be some sort of suffering that accompanies a person in life. There will always be, things that are imperfect in our lives, at least, if not downright, horrible. So yes, on a certain level, it's true that an individual person also cannot be perfected in the strict sense, in the strictest of senses, right? Only God is absolutely perfect. And only God can create a world that would be absolutely perfect. And that's what will happen in the new heavens and the new earth after the second coming of Jesus. But I think it's important to realize too that there's another way, another angle at looking at this. There is a certain thing, a certain amount of moral perfection that a person. There is a certain amount of moral perfection that a person can achieve within this life, at least in Catholic and Orthodox, like Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox theology, right? We believe in salvation as a transformation instead of just a covering, as opposed to many Protestant denominations, although not all, believe more in that God just covers us with grace instead of actually transforming us into a new creation. So, and what we mean by that new creation is, even in this life, a person can be morally perfected. Now that cannot be done on one's own. That cannot be done by one's own strength. That can only be done by the grace of God. Only God can procure that sort of a result within a human being. and the human being participates in that they are open to the grace of God and conform themselves to God's will. So yes, there is a certain sense in which there can be a perfection within the individual human being, but it's only a moral perfection. So anyway, I thought that was worth bearing out and just making that distinction there, because people might get confused by what I'm saying. That they might think, oh, well, perfection's impossible in any way, right? But no, there is such a thing as moral perfection in this life, and that's what we would call sanctity, someone who has been sanctified in this life. And again, that's only by the grace of God. It is only by the grace of God. No man or woman can become sanctified, morally perfected, except by the grace of God. All right. Well, thank you. I hope that this episode has been interesting for you. And I need to figure out what the next episodes are going to be. I have like a whole list of episode ideas, but now that we're kind of getting out of the social issues topic, and then this topic of utopianism kind of flowed out of our last episode of the social issues topic, which was the episode on transhumanism. And if you want, you can go back to listen to that one if you haven't already. But yeah, I got to figure out what our next few episodes are going to be and where I want to turn for topics. So if you have any ideas, please feel free to email me at parkerhzerbah@gmail.com or at parkerzerbahcatechesis@gmail.com. You can also message me on Facebook. You can find my Facebook page at Catholicism in the Car. I have a Twitter page at PZ, like my initials, Parker Zerbah, PZ Catechesis. That's my Twitter page. You can find YouTube, comment on any of the videos on there. The YouTube page is Catholicism in the Car. And I actually I'm starting a Patreon page. So if you really enjoy the content and you want to support me in any way, that would be great. I do put quite a few hours every week into this podcast and the YouTube channel. I probably put anywhere between maybe around 8 hours a week into it. Maybe more, 8 to 10 hours a week into it. So it would be incredibly helpful to have some sort of monetization through this podcast and through the YouTube channel in order to just help my family out. I have a young child. He's 8 months old. My wife doesn't work, so I'm the sole provider for the family, and I don't make a whole ton of money. Anything that could help would be greatly appreciated. Again, you can find me on Patreon. I think there's also a way through Anchor FM for you to contribute to the podcast. You can find it at the bottom of any of my podcast episodes. I believe there's a link to that Anchor podcast site, which if you just type in Catholicism in the Car on the anchor.fm site, you should be able to find that way too to support the podcast. And I'm going to try to see if there's any other ways. But right now it's Patreon, and then also anchor.fm. There's a way for you to monetize the podcast from there as well. So yeah, I want to thank everybody for all of your support, and it's been a great journey thus far. Again, find me on Facebook, CatholicismInTheCar.com, on Twitter, on YouTube. Please, if you find me on YouTube, subscribe, because that helps immensely for these podcasts and these videos to be distributed to a larger audience. So anyway, all right. God bless you, and we will talk again soon. Adios.